The old car sputtered and died on that desolate road, exhaling one last sigh of smoke into the brutal 40-degree air. My heart was already aching from David's harsh words, but stepping out into the whiteout, the wind tore through my thin coat, chilling me to the bone. Then my knee twisted on hidden ice, sending a scream of pain up my leg. I was stranded, injured, and utterly alone, trapped in nature's icy grip. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. The last words David spoke still echoed in my ears, colder than the air that rushed in when I slammed the car door shut. "Just go, Mom. We can't do this anymore." The sting of them felt like a physical bruise on my heart, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. My old sedan coughed to life, sounding as heartbroken as I felt. And I pointed it down the winding back road I often took to avoid the highway traffic, hoping a change of scenery might change my mood. The sky was already a bruised purple, promising snow, but I didn't think much of it then. Just another Montana winter, I figured. A few miles out, the car started to grumble, a deep, unhappy sound from under the hood. Then, a shudder, like an old dog shaking off water, and the engine coughed, sputtered, and finally fell silent. Just like that. The radio, which had been playing a soft Christmas carol, died too. A heavy quiet descended, broken only by the growing howl of the wind. My breath plumed out in front of me, thick and white. I tried the key again, turning it with a hopeful twist, but the engine just clicked weakly, a pathetic sound against the rising storm. My heart sank, a cold pebble dropping into a deep well. I knew this road. It wasn't completely deserted, but it wasn't busy either, especially not with the weather turning. Panic, a cold little snake, started to coil in my stomach. I looked at my phone, pulling it from my purse, but the screen was black, dead from the cold, or maybe just from age. No signal out here anyway, not on this stretch. I was truly on my own. The snow, which had been a gentle flurry, now whipped around the car in a frenzy, tiny icy needles stinging my cheeks through the window. I pushed the door open, the sound of the wind suddenly deafening. It felt like a giant, angry hand shoving me backward. I needed to at least try and clear some of the fresh snow from around the tires. My flimsy winter coat, meant for a quick trip to the grocery store, felt like tissue paper against the brutal cold that immediately started to seep into my bones. I fumbled in the trunk, pulling out the tiny plastic snow shovel I kept for emergencies. It felt ridiculously small against the drifts already piling up. I bent down, the wind tearing at my hair, and started to scoop, my fingers quickly growing numb inside my thin gloves. The snow was soft at first, then heavy, wet, and surprisingly deep. My muscles ached with the effort, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. I dug for what felt like an eternity, but the snow just kept coming, piling up faster than I could clear it. My cheeks burned with cold, and my nose felt like a block of ice. Then, it happened. My foot, numb and clumsy, slid on a slick patch of black ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. My body twisted awkwardly, and I heard a sickening pop from my knee. A scream tore from my throat, raw and involuntary, as a white-hot agony shot up my leg. I collapsed into the snow, the shovel flying from my numb fingers, landing with a muffled thud. The pain was excruciating, throbbing with every beat of my heart, making my head swim. Tears, a mix of pain and despair, froze on my eyelashes. I lay there for a moment, gasping, trying to breathe past the agony. My knee throbbed, a dull, relentless ache spreading through my leg. Every attempt to move sent fresh waves of torment through me. Getting back up seemed an impossible feat. The blizzard raged around me, a swirling vortex of white, and I could barely see the outlines of my car through the blinding snow. The daylight was fading fast, replaced by a bruised, angry twilight. The temperature was dropping with it, biting deeper, threatening to steal the warmth from my very core. I was injured, alone, and trapped, with the world turning into a vast, frozen tomb around me. And now, with the last sliver of light vanishing, where was I supposed to go? The pain in my knee was a hot, screaming thing, echoing the cold dread that settled deep in my chest. Lying there in the snow, the blizzard already a furious white curtain around me, I knew I couldn't stay. The car was a metal box, quickly being swallowed by the drifts, and even if I could get back inside, it offered no lasting warmth. My breath plumed out in ragged gasps, and the raw cold was already seeping through my coat, chilling my skin beneath my clothes. I had to move, even with my throbbing leg. I scanned the swirling white for anything, any small promise of shelter. Through the furious snowfall, I could just make out a dark, shadowy clump of spruce trees, maybe 30 feet away, where the snow seemed to pile a little higher, perhaps offering a slight reprieve from the wind. It looked like a small, humped shadow against the blinding white, a dark promise in the desolation. Getting there felt like an impossible journey across an Arctic wasteland. Pushing myself up was an agony that stole my breath. I gritted my teeth, a whimper escaping my lips as I put the slightest weight on my injured leg. It buckled, sending another jolt of pain up to my hip. No, standing was out. I dropped back to my hands and good knee, then started to crawl, dragging my bad leg behind me like a dead weight. The snow was powdery and dry at first, then wet and icy underneath, soaking through my gloves and the thin fabric of my pants. Every inch was a monumental effort, my shoulders screaming, my hands growing numb from the biting cold that seemed to suck the warmth right out of me. The wind clawed at my back, pushing me, mocking my slow progress. Finally, after what felt like an hour of agonizing crawling, I reached the cluster of trees. It wasn't much, just a few scraggly spruces, but the snow had drifted high against their trunks, creating a sort of small, natural bank. It wasn't a cave, but it was something. I dug at the snow with my numb, aching hands, scooping it away, trying to hollow out a space big enough to curl into. The snow was heavy, wet, and surprisingly resistant, and my fingers felt like clumsy clubs. I used the tiny plastic shovel for a bit, but it kept slipping from my grip, and the effort of bending over sent sharp pains through my knee. I scraped away at the frozen earth under the snow, exposing the damp, dark soil. The smell of pine needles, wet and sharp, mingled with the earthy scent of the frozen ground. My hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from sheer exhaustion and the fear that gnawed at me. I cleared a small hollow, just large enough to huddle in, then tried to break off some low, dead branches from the spruce trees. They snapped with a brittle crack in the bitter cold, the rough bark scraping my raw fingers. I piled them on the bottom of my little hollow, hoping they'd offer a tiny bit of insulation from the frozen ground, and then pulled more snow around the opening, creating a small wall to block the worst of the wind. It was crude, flimsy, and far from warm, but it was better than nothing. I finally managed to pull myself into the cramped space, curling into a tight ball. My injured knee screamed in protest, but I had to protect it, tucking it close to my body. The air inside smelled of damp earth and sharp pine, but it was still bitterly cold. Just a few degrees warmer than the outside, perhaps. But the wind was muffled, a distant, mournful howl. I shivered uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw ached. My clothes were damp, and the cold was a heavy blanket, pressing down on me. I tried to rub my hands together, but they were too numb to feel much. Exhaustion weighed on me, a heavy, suffocating thing, but sleep felt impossible, a luxury I couldn't afford. Every muscle ached, every bone felt like ice, and the cold, the relentless, bone-deep cold, seemed to be seeping into my very soul. I lay there, listening to the storm rage outside my pitiful little burrow, and I knew this was only the beginning. The night had been a blur of shivering and pain. Every few minutes, a fresh wave of cold would wash over me, sending shivers through my whole body, making my teeth chatter so violently my jaw ached. My injured knee throbbed with a dull, constant ache, stiffening more with every hour I lay still. When the first faint gray light finally began to filter through the thick snow outside my makeshift burrow, it brought no warmth, only a starker view of my desperate situation. My breath still plumed out in front of me, a cloud of despair in the icy air. My stomach growled, a hollow, mournful sound, reminding me that I hadn't eaten anything substantial since yesterday morning. I fumbled in my purse, my fingers stiff and clumsy, pulling out the small thermos. It was stone cold. The lukewarm tea I'd brought from David's house, now a chilling reminder of warmth lost. I took a small sip anyway, the cold liquid a shock to my throat. But it was wet. Then I found the single stale biscuit I'd tucked away. It was hard as a rock, tasteless and dry, but I chewed it slowly, letting it dissolve bit by bit on my tongue, forcing myself to feel grateful for even that tiny scrap. It barely made a dent in the gnawing hunger, but it was something. What I really needed, what my entire body screamed for, was heat, a fire. But to have a fire, I needed fuel. I peered out of my snowy hollow. The blizzard hadn't let up much, still a swirling mass of white, but the angry howls of the wind seemed a little less ferocious than in the darkest hours of the night. Getting out would be another agonizing crawl. Pushing myself up was a slow, painful process. My knee screamed in protest, a sharp, stabbing pain that made me dizzy. I steadied myself against the rough bark of a spruce tree, then began to hobble, using the tree trunks as support, crawling and dragging my bad leg through the deeper snow near the base of the trees. My eyes scanned the ground frantically, searching for anything that looked dry enough to burn. The snow was deep, but underneath, I hoped to find some fallen twigs, dead leaves, anything. My fingers, still raw and numb from the night before, plunged into the powdery snow. It was a painstaking search. Most of what I found was damp, frozen solid, or too thick to break with my bare hands. But slowly, painstakingly, I started to find things. Little brittle twigs, no thicker than my pinky finger, snapped easily. Some dry, papery bark peeled from a fallen branch. I even found a few small, dried-up cones, their scales stiff and rough. Each tiny piece felt like a treasure, a small victory against the vast, indifferent cold. I gathered them into a pitiful pile on my lap, back inside my burrow. The collection was so small, so fragile. It looked like a bird's nest, not enough to sustain any real heat. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer exhaustion of the effort. My good knee was chafed and sore from crawling, and my injured one throbbed relentlessly. The cold was a heavy cloak, pressing down on me, whispering doubts into my ear. How could I even start a fire without a match, let alone keep it going with this meager offering? The sun, what little of it managed to filter through the thick clouds, was already beginning its slow descent. My small pile of fuel felt utterly inadequate. This little bit might give me a few minutes of warmth, a fleeting flicker of light against the encroaching darkness, but it wouldn't last the night. I knew with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the blizzard, that I needed more. Much more. But how was I going to find it? With my body failing and the storm still raging before the next brutal night descended. The little pile of twigs I'd managed to gather looked more like a prayer than a source of heat. So small, so delicate. It wouldn't last 5 minutes against the monstrous cold of the coming night. My stomach clenched tighter, a different kind of ache joining the throbbing in my knee. I needed more. Not just twigs, but something substantial, a real piece of wood that could hold a flame for more than a breath. I peered out again, straining my eyes through the relentless swirl of snow. Beyond the immediate cluster of spruces, the ground sloped gently down towards what looked like a denser thicket, perhaps an old fallen log buried beneath the white. It was further than I had dared to venture so far, maybe 20 or 30 feet from my burrow. The thought of crawling that far, dragging my throbbing leg, filled me with a fresh wave of dread. But the alternative, freezing, was a far more terrifying thought. Gritting my teeth, I began to push myself forward, inch by agonizing inch. My good knee, already raw from scraping against the frozen ground, complained with every movement. My hands, numb and clumsy, pushed against the snow, trying to get purchase. Each time I tried to shift my weight even slightly onto my injured leg, a white-hot spear of pain shot up, making my vision blur for a moment. I focused on the rough texture of the spruce needles under my gloves, the sharp, cold scent of the snow, anything to distract from the agony. I reached the edge of the deeper snowdrift, where the ground dropped away a bit. I could just make out the dark, humped shape of what seemed to be a large branch or a small log, mostly buried. Hope, thin and fragile, flickered in my chest. If I could just get to it, maybe break off a piece. I stretched my good leg forward, trying to hook my foot around a small, visible root to pull myself down into the drift. But my injured knee, stiff and uncooperative, twisted under me as I shifted. There was another sickening pop, louder and sharper this time, followed by an explosion of pain that stole my breath. I cried out, a strangled sound that was immediately swallowed by the wind. My leg gave out completely, sending me tumbling a few feet down into the deeper snow. I landed awkwardly, my bad knee digging into something hard beneath the fresh powder, sending another searing wave of agony through my body. I lay there, gasping for air, the world spinning. My knee felt like it was on fire, a hot pulsing agony that made my eyes water uncontrollably. I couldn't move it, not even a wiggle, without a fresh surge of torment. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I had pushed too hard, and now I was worse off than before. The log, so close, now felt an impossible distance away, mocking me from its snowy bed. A forced calm, born of sheer exhaustion and the stark reality of my situation, slowly settled over me. There was no point in crying, no point in panicking. It wouldn't fix my leg, and it wouldn't bring me warmth. I closed my eyes, taking slow, shaky breaths, trying to push past the pain. I couldn't get to the bigger wood. I couldn't even effectively use the small shovel anymore, as bending over was agony. My dream of a roaring fire, a big, comforting blaze, vanished like smoke in the wind. But then a memory, soft as a whisper, drifted through the fog of pain and cold. Grandma Agnes, her hands, gnarled and strong, teaching me how to build a storytelling fire. Not a big hungry fire, she'd say, but a small, persistent glow. "It's not about burning big logs, Ellie Mae," she'd told me, her voice warm like embers. "It's about coaxing warmth from the smallest things, arranged just so, to reflect every bit of heat back to you." She'd shown me how to find the tiniest, driest wisps of moss, the thinnest, most brittle twigs, and how to arrange them like a little teepee, protecting the precious spark. A new kind of determination, quiet and steady, began to take root in my frozen heart. I couldn't move far, but I could reach. I could use my good arm and my good leg. I started to scan the ground around me again, not for big pieces, but for the tiniest, most insignificant bits. Little shards of bark, dry pine needles, pieces of frozen grass that might still hold a hint of dryness. I used my hands, now stiff and aching, to carefully scrape away the top layer of snow, feeling for anything that might offer a spark. Every tiny piece I found, I added to my meager pile, placing it carefully. It was slow, painstaking work, my fingers growing more clumsy with the cold, but I felt a new focus, a quiet purpose. My knee throbbed, but my mind was clearer. I had the tiniest bits of kindling now, a delicate, fragile hope nestled in my lap. But the storm still raged, the light was fading fast, and I had no way to light them. The tiny pile of dry needles and brittle twigs lay in my lap, a fragile promise in the bitter cold. My fingers, still aching and clumsy, gently prodded them. I had the fuel, however meager, but still no spark. Despair, cold and heavy, started to settle in again, a suffocating blanket. It was then, as the last vestiges of twilight turned the swirling snow outside a bruised purple, that her face bloomed in my mind, clear as if she were sitting right beside me. Grandma Agnes. I could almost smell the faint scent of wood smoke and lavender that always clung to her sweaters. Her hands, gnarled from years of working the land, but surprisingly gentle, were showing me, a small girl of maybe 8, how to build a fire in a little stone pit in their Montana backyard. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air bites just enough to make you pull your sweater tighter, but not enough to hurt. The sun was dipping below the distant mountains, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. "Now, Ellie Mae." Her voice was a soft rumble, like a warm, purring cat. "Most folks think a fire needs big logs and a roaring blaze, but sometimes, honey, all you need is a whisper of warmth, just enough to chase the shadows away and keep the stories alive." She had knelt beside me, her breath smelling of peppermint tea, and pointed to a tiny, almost invisible wisp of dried moss. "This here," she'd said, her finger gently nudging the moss, "is your heart. It needs protection." She'd shown me how to arrange small, flat stones in a tight circle, creating a little cup to hold the flame, like cupping your hands around a precious secret. "Every bit of heat," she'd explained, her eyes twinkling in the dimming light. "We want it to bounce right back to you. No wasted warmth out here." Then she'd carefully place the driest, thinnest slivers of pine bark, like delicate lace, around the moss. "These are your kindling. They catch fast, burn quick, and they're your invitation to the fire." She'd given me a magnifying glass, a big heavy one with a brass rim, the kind old men used for reading maps. "And this," she'd said, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes, "is your magic. The sun's own fire, brought down to size." She'd held the glass just so, focusing a tiny, brilliant beam of sunlight onto the moss. We waited, our heads close together, and I could feel the warmth of her arm against mine. The smell of burning moss, faint and earthy, had slowly started to tickle my nose. A tiny wisp of smoke, then a hesitant flicker of orange. "There," she'd breathed, "the spark of life. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this." Then she'd patiently added the smallest, driest twigs, one by one, carefully, so as not to smother the newborn flame. "Slow and steady, darling. A fire needs coaxing, not rushing. It's like tending to a baby." The fire had grown, not into a big, roaring blaze, but a small, persistent glow, just enough to warm my small hands and cast dancing shadows on the back porch. We'd sat there for hours, just the two of us, telling stories, the little fire a comforting heart between us. The memory, so vivid, chased away some of the cold. I didn't have a magnifying glass, of course, and the sun was long gone, swallowed by the storm. But I did have a small, silver locket hanging from a chain around my neck, a gift from Grandma Agnes years ago. It held a tiny, faded picture of her. It was heavy, solid silver, and surprisingly shiny on one side where it had rubbed against my clothes. And I had a faint, desperate thought. I fumbled with the clasp, my stiff fingers clumsy, and managed to open the locket. The silver was cold against my skin. My mind raced, trying to remember what else she had taught me about sparks, about friction. I looked at the dark, exposed ground in my burrow, then at the locket, then at the sharp, flinty edge of a small rock I'd cleared away earlier. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but Grandma Agnes's steady gaze from the locket seemed to say, "Try, Ellie Mae. Never stop trying." My heart hammered against my ribs, a new kind of warmth spreading through me, not from the cold, but from a flicker of hope that felt ancient and strong, connecting me to her across time and the raging storm. My numb fingers fumbled with the silver locket, cold and slick against my skin. My eyes, weary and gritty from the long night, scanned the tiny pile of dry kindling in my lap, then flickered to the sharp, flinty edge of the rock I'd managed to clear from the frozen ground. Grandma Agnes's words echoed in my mind. "It's about coaxing warmth from the smallest things, arranged just so, to reflect every bit of heat back to you. I took a shaky breath, the cold air burning my lungs. This was it. My hands trembled as I brought the locket to the rock. I remembered her teaching me about friction, about how even the smallest scrape could create a spark if you were patient and determined. My fingers, stiff as twigs, tried to hold the tiny, brittle pieces of dry moss and pine needles steady with one hand, while the other tried to strike the locket against the rock. It was awkward, clumsy work. The silver scraped against the stone with a dull clink, but no spark. Again. Clink. Nothing. My shoulders ached, my bad knee throbbed, and frustration, a hot, bitter taste, filled my mouth. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Grandma Agnes's calm, steady face. Slow and steady, darling. A fire needs coaxing, not rushing. I opened my eyes, took another deep breath, and tried again, this time with more focus, imagining her strong hands guiding mine. Scrape, scrape, strike. A tiny, fleeting pinprick of orange light flickered, then vanished. My heart leaped. It was there. I tried again, concentrating every ounce of my will into my clumsy fingers. Scrape, scrape, strike. This time, a hesitant orange spark flew from the rock, landing right on a wisp of dry moss. For a second, nothing. Then, a tiny curl of smoke, thin and delicate, rose into the frigid air, smelling faintly of pine and earth. My breath hitched. It was so small, so fragile. I leaned in, shielding the nascent flame with my cupped hands, blowing ever so gently, just as Grandma Agnes had taught me. The smoke thickened, and then a tiny brave flicker of orange light danced within the moss. It was alive. I carefully, painstakingly, added the thinnest slivers of pine bark, then the smallest, most brittle twigs, just as she had shown me. The flame grew, timid at first, then gaining confidence, a tiny, persistent heart beating in the middle of my burrow. The immediate warmth was almost imperceptible to my chilled body, but the sight of the dancing light, casting flickering shadows on the snowy walls of my shelter, was a profound comfort. I held my stiff, aching hands over it, feeling a faint, blessed warmth seep into my fingertips. The smell of burning pine was a sweet perfume in the cold air. This wasn't a roaring bonfire, not by any stretch, but it was my fire, a defiant spark against the vast indifference of the blizzard. With the fire a steady, if small, presence, I felt a surge of energy, a quiet determination. I still couldn't move much, but I could reach. I started to gather more spruce boughs from the low-hanging branches around me, pulling them carefully towards my burrow. My good arm ached with the effort, but I didn't stop. I piled the rough, prickly branches against the snowy walls of my shelter, creating a thicker barrier against the wind and cold. The needles smelled wonderfully green and alive, a sharp contrast to the frozen world outside. I even managed to find a few more flat stones and carefully arrange them around my tiny fire pit, remembering Grandma Agnes's lesson about reflecting heat. The fire, protected and surrounded by stones, glowed with a more robust light. I even melted a small handful of snow in the hollow of the locket itself, the silver heating up quickly. The water was icy cold, but it was wet, and the metallic taste mingled with the faint pine smoke as I sipped it, letting it trickle down my parched throat. It felt like drinking pure life. My small burrow, once a desperate hole in the ground, now felt different. The spruce boughs added a soft, resilient layer, blocking the wind's bite. The fire, though small, chased away the deepest, most crushing cold, and its light pushed back the oppressive darkness. My knee still throbbed, my stomach still growled, and the blizzard still howled its mournful song outside. But inside my tiny, handmade refuge, a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to bloom. It was a quiet sense of accomplishment, a deep, surprising wellspring of peace. I was still stranded, still in danger, but as I watched the flames dance, a peculiar warmth spread through my chest, not just from the fire, but from something deeper. I was beginning to feel comfortable. That tiny fire, bless its heart, gave me a sliver of hope, but it was just a whisper against the roaring monster of the night. The warmth barely kissed my skin before the real cold, the deep bone-aching kind, started to creep back in, finding every exposed patch of skin, every threadbare part of my coat. The wind outside my spruce burrow intensified, a mournful, relentless howl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. It was like the world itself was trying to freeze me solid, to squeeze the last bit of warmth from my body. I had to keep the fire alive. Every few minutes I'd reach out, my fingers stiff and clumsy, searching for more of the delicate kindling I'd collected. The tiny twigs and needles were disappearing fast, burning down to fine ash almost as soon as they caught. My injured knee throbbed with a dull, constant ache, making any movement a monumental effort. I couldn't shift much without a fresh wave of pain, so I had to stretch my good arm as far as it could reach, feeling for anything dry, anything that might feed the hungry little flame. Sometimes my fingers would brush against frozen earth or a clump of icy snow, sending a sharp jolt of cold up my arm. The hours stretched, endless and dark. I fought off sleep, knowing that to drift off was to invite the cold to claim me. My eyelids felt heavy, so heavy, like they were weighted with ice. Just closing my eyes just for a moment felt like the sweetest promise, a warm bed in a distant dream. But Grandma Agnes's voice, clear as a bell, rang in my head. "You fall asleep out here, Ellie Mae, and you won't wake up." I forced my eyes open, staring at the fragile flame, willing myself to stay awake, to stay alive. The memories of David's harsh words mingled with the fear, a cold ache in my heart that rivaled the chill in my bones. I felt so utterly alone, so terribly small against this vast, indifferent night. My throat was raw and dry, and my stomach growled, a hollow, desperate sound. I'd melt a tiny bit of snow in the locket again, then sip the icy water, letting it trickle down, a faint metallic taste mixing with the smoke. It barely helped, but it was something. My toes and fingers were beyond numb, a dull, aching throb that worried me. I tried to rub them together, to bring some feeling back, but it was like rubbing two pieces of wood. The cold seemed to be settling deeper, into my very core, making my thoughts slow and fuzzy. A terrible lethargy started to creep in, a dangerous, inviting numbness. The wind roared louder, and a fresh wave of snow, finer and drier than before, began to sift through the gaps in my spruce boughs, dusting my makeshift bed. I pulled my thin coat tighter, scrunching my shoulders up to my ears, trying to make myself as small as possible, to conserve every precious bit of warmth. The little fire, for all my efforts, seemed to shrink and falter, its light growing weaker, its heat barely reaching me. Despair, a heavy, suffocating blanket, threatened to smother me. This was the coldest I had ever been, a cold that felt like it was going to stop my heart. Just when I thought I couldn't bear another minute, couldn't find another twig, couldn't force my eyes open one more time, a subtle shift happened. It wasn't light, not really, but a faint, bruised color started to bleed into the swirling white outside my burrow. The absolute blackness of the night, that suffocating blanket, began to soften, just a whisper. The wind, though still strong, seemed to lose some of its furious edge, its howl becoming a little less angry, a little more mournful. My eyes, gritty and sore, strained to see. The world was still frozen, still silent, except for the distant moan of the wind. But that deep, impenetrable darkness, the one that had held me captive for what felt like an eternity, was finally lifting. A faint, gray light, barely visible through the thick snow, was beginning to push its way into the world. I was still here. I was still alive. The gray light of morning, though still frigid and weak, brought with it a fragile kind of hope. My tiny fire, against all odds, was still alive. A brave little heart, beating in the middle of my icy burrow. I carefully nudged another sliver of bark onto its glowing embers, watching the smoke curl upwards, thin and wispy, before being snatched away by the relentless wind. My knee was a solid block of pain, stiff and screaming every time I shifted even an inch. My stomach growled like a hungry wolf, and my throat felt like sandpaper, but I was awake. I was breathing. I was just trying to melt another mouthful of snow in my locket when I heard it. A faint, distant drone, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the frozen earth. My first thought was the wind, playing tricks on my exhausted mind, mimicking some far-off sound. I shook my head, trying to clear the fuzzy tiredness. But then it came again, clearer this time, definitely not the wind. It was a mechanical sound, like an engine, but muffled by the heavy snow and the still howling wind. My heart leaped into my throat, a sudden frantic bird trapped in my chest. Was it a snowmobile? A truck? Out here? My hands started to tremble, a mix of wild hope and terror seizing me. What if they didn't see me? What if they just passed by? My little fire gave off so little smoke, and my burrow was so well hidden by the snowdrifts and spruce boughs. "Hello!" I tried to shout, but my voice was a hoarse whisper, raw and weak from the cold and dehydration. It was swallowed immediately by the storm. I tried again, pushing with all my might, a desperate, raspy plea. "Help!" It was useless. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer, a rumble that now vibrated through the snow around me. It was definitely a snowmobile, maybe more than one. I looked around frantically. My flimsy coat, already soaked and frozen, wouldn't wave. I had nothing bright, nothing visible. Then my eyes fell on the red scarf I'd tied around my neck, a soft woolen thing David had given me years ago. It was a vibrant crimson, a stark splash of color against the blinding white. With clumsy, aching fingers, I untied it, my teeth chattering from the sudden exposure of my neck to the cold. I couldn't stand, couldn't even kneel properly, but I could stretch. I pushed the scarf out of the entrance to my burrow, as far as my good arm could reach, waving it feebly, a small, desperate flag against the vast white. The engine noise suddenly died down, much closer now, followed by the crunch of boots on snow, and then voices, muffled masculine voices, carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there. Real voices, not just the storm. Tears, hot and stinging, sprang to my eyes, immediately freezing on my cheeks. I kept waving the scarf, my arm aching with the effort, trying to make myself seen. Then, a sudden exclamation, closer still. "Over here! I see something!" A figure, bundled in a heavy winter suit, appeared through the swirling snow, walking towards my burrow. Another followed. Their faces were obscured by hoods and scarves, but their eyes, when they finally looked down at me, were wide with shock and concern. One of them knelt, careful not to get too close to my fragile structure. "Ma'am, are you all right? Are you hurt?" The voice was deep, unfamiliar. I just nodded, unable to speak, my throat too tight with emotion. The relief, a tidal wave, washed over me, making my limbs feel like jelly. I was found. I was safe. Then the second figure stepped closer, pulling down his face mask. His eyes, the same piercing blue as my own, met mine. It was David. His face was pale, streaked with worry and something else, something I couldn't quite place. His lips were pressed into a thin line. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, his gaze sweeping over my snow-caked clothes, my bruised face, my awkwardly bent knee. The relief that had soared through me suddenly dropped, replaced by a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The man who had thrown me out onto the street was now the one who had found me, a desperate, broken thing in a hole in the ground. And in his eyes, I saw not just concern, but a flicker of something that made my blood run cold. The man who had knelt was a stranger, wrapped in so many layers I couldn't see his face properly. But David, standing over me, had pulled down his mask, his breath pluming out in the frigid air. His eyes, those familiar blue eyes, held a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe guilt, maybe pity, maybe just the raw discomfort of seeing his mother in such a state. The knot in my stomach tightened, a cold, hard lump. "Mom," he said, his voice rough with emotion, or maybe just cold. "What are you doing out here? We've been looking for you all night." He didn't sound angry, not exactly, but there was a reprimand in his tone, a heavy question that made my defenses rise. The other man, the stranger, spoke then, his voice kinder. "We need to get you out of this cold, ma'am. You're hypothermic." He carefully nudged a thick, insulated blanket towards me, its synthetic fabric a stark contrast to the rough spruce boughs I was lying on. The smell of gasoline from their snowmobiles, sharp and chemical, mingled oddly with the sweet pine smoke of my little fire. Part of me, the part that was bone-weary and aching, screamed to be wrapped in that blanket, to be lifted into a warm snowmobile, to feel the blessed heat of a roaring furnace. My knee throbbed a relentless rhythm, and the memory of a soft bed, a hot cup of tea, felt like a distant, impossible dream. I pictured Sarah, David's wife, bustling around her warm kitchen, the scent of coffee and cinnamon. It was a powerful pull, a siren song promising an end to the brutal hardship. But then I looked at my fire, its small flame dancing bravely, reflecting in David's concerned, yet still distant eyes. I saw the tiny cup of melted snow in my locket, the spruce boughs I'd piled, the little sanctuary I'd built with my own hands. I remembered Grandma Agnes's voice, not just about the fire, but about finding strength in yourself, about weathering storms. This little hole in the ground, this meager fire, had been my entire world for what felt like an eternity, and in it, I had found a resilience I never knew I possessed. I had faced down the cold, the hunger, the fear, and I had survived. I had not needed David, or Sarah, or anyone else. I had done it myself. "I'm all right," I managed to croak, my voice still a raw whisper. It wasn't entirely true, but it felt important to say. I built a fire. I tried to gesture to it, a small flicker of pride warming my chest more than the actual flames. David's gaze dropped to the fire, then back to my face, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He didn't understand. He saw a desperate, injured old woman in a hole, not the fierce, independent spirit I had found in the depths of the storm. The thought of going back, of being a burden again, of hearing those cold words once more, was a deeper chill than the blizzard. My tiny burrow, for all its discomfort, felt like a haven from the emotional cold of the world I'd left behind. Here, I was in charge. Here, I was strong. The rescuer, sensing my hesitation, gently offered the blanket again. "It's still well below zero, ma'am. We need to get you seen by a doctor. That knee looks bad." I looked at my knee, swollen and purple beneath my ripped pants, a sharp pang of pain reminding me of my vulnerability. The logical part of my mind screamed to accept their help, to let the professionals take over. But the other part, the wild, stubborn part that had just survived a night in the wilderness, resisted. It was a war within me, between the soft comfort of surrender and the hard-won pride of self-reliance. This refuge, born of desperation, had become something more. It was a testament to my own strength. David took another step closer, his voice softer this time, but still laced with that underlying tension. "Mom, please let us help you. You can't stay out here." He reached a gloved hand towards me, but stopped short, as if unsure how to touch me. I looked at his outstretched hand, then at the fierce, tiny flame. To leave this place meant walking back into the complicated, painful world of family and expectations, a world where I had felt so small and unwanted. But to stay meant facing the blizzard alone again, with a bad knee and dwindling strength. The decision hung in the air, heavy and inescapable, demanding an answer. Which kind of cold was I more afraid of? Well, eventually, I let them help me. The cold was just too much, and David, for all his earlier harshness, looked genuinely relieved when I finally nodded. They wrapped me in that thick, scratchy blanket, and the sheer physical relief was like a warm wave washing over my frozen body. Getting me onto the snowmobile was another ordeal, a symphony of sharp pains from my knee, but the thought of a warm bed spurred me on. The ride back was a blur of bumps and wind, but I remember gripping David's jacket, feeling the strong beat of his heart through the layers. Later, much later, tucked into a hospital bed, warm and fed, with my knee wrapped and thankfully not broken, just a bad sprain, I had time to think. And boy, did I think. The world looked different to me now. Food, for instance. Before, a stale biscuit was just that, a stale biscuit. Now, the memory of that dry, hard little thing, chewed slowly in my freezing burrow, tasted like pure survival, like the most precious meal I'd ever had. And water. Just a few sips of melted snow, metallic and icy, felt like the purest spring, a lifeline I'd drawn from the very heart of the storm. I look at a glass of water now, and I don't just see thirst quenched. I see life itself. Warmth, though, that's the big one. I used to take it for granted, didn't we all? A flick of a thermostat, a cozy blanket, a hot cup of tea. Now I understand warmth with my whole body. I remember that tiny fire, its delicate flame licking at the cold, how it smelled of pine and earth, how its almost invisible heat kept the deepest chill at bay. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was hope, a brave little heart beating in the darkness. Every time I light a candle now, or feel the sun on my face, it's a prayer, a profound gratitude for that simple, precious comfort. And people. Seeing David out there, his face etched with worry, well, it was complicated. The sting of his words from before the storm was still there, a dull ache. But seeing him, knowing he'd come looking for me, even after our fight, it softened something inside me. It showed me that even when words are sharp, sometimes love, or at least concern, still runs deeper. We haven't talked about what happened yet. Not really. But there's a different kind of quiet between us now. A more understanding one. I used to feel so much hurt from his impatience, but now I feel a strange sense of peace, knowing that even when I push them away, there are still people who will come looking. The silence of that blizzard, the absolute, isolating silence, also changed me. Before, silence was just the absence of noise. Out there, it was a living, breathing thing, sometimes terrifying, sometimes comforting. It forced me to listen, not to the world outside, but to the whispers within myself. To the fear, yes, but also to the quiet strength, the stubborn refusal to give up. I realized I was capable of so much more than I ever gave myself credit for. I, Eleanor May Higgins, the librarian who loved her books and tea, built a fire with a locket and survived a Montana blizzard. That knowledge, that deep, quiet certainty, is a warmth no fire could ever truly give. Life throws blizzards at us, honey. Sometimes literal, sometimes just in the heart. But you've always got a spark inside you, even if it's just a whisper. You just have to be brave enough to find it and coax it into a flame. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.